Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name, of course, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in, and what a day it is. Happy Thursday, the official start of the NFL season. Hope you guys are tuning into tonight's game. I know I will. Should be very exciting. A rematch of the AFC Championship game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens. Before we kind of get into full swing of things for the season, I do want to if there are any last-minute fantasy football drafters out there, talk a little bit more about some injury concerns and injury updates, including the fantasy implications with them. And also I'm going to be doing a little bit of a draft or pass series where I'm talking about some key players and key positions that I think you should either target or avoid. I will give you my final verdict on them as well. Before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you, as always, to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network. Anything that you do for the network and the show is greatly appreciated. Also, if you haven't already, since we are now a live show as well, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. We really want this show to be all about you. Interaction is key, especially as the NFL season starts. I want all your analyses, your questions, your comments, your concerns, about anything. If you even want to steer the show in another direction, I will be willing to hear whatever you have to say. Anything you need, I will do my best to give you that information. But it's ultimately up to you, my audience, whether or not you want to participate. This is just a friendly reminder that there are so many different ways, and whatever you do is greatly appreciated. But without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. And our first segment of the day is kind of an injury update with a lot of fantasy implications and fantasy fallout. This player, clearly one of the most revered, not just in real life, but in fantasy football circles everywhere, for what he did and what he meant to the position as a whole. However, sadly, as many of you know, week 2 of last year, he suffered a very similar injury to one he had already sustained in college, tearing both his ACL and MCL out for the entirety of the season. Now at the start of this season, on the physically unable to perform list, will miss at least 4 games. We are, of course, talking about Nick Chubb. Now, Nick Chubb, like I said, has always been the picture of consistency when it comes to the running back position, and most importantly, being a top running back at the position as well. Really vaulting the running back market into the stratosphere, really revolutionizing the position. I don't necessarily think you would see the top of the running back market be so heavy and be so highly coveted early in the first round if it wasn't for someone like Nick Chubb. Because Nick Chubb really pushes the envelope in terms of how people draft, and as a result, it became a market that was highly coveted, and as a result, you're seeing more and more running backs taken in higher drafts. We're seeing, in fact, 2 in Christian McCaffrey and Breece Hall being talked about as the first or second overall draft picks. So that, however, kind of changed, because now Nick Chubb isn't there to really, kind of make fantasy drafts in a way exciting, because the excitement of having almost 3 solid running backs early in the first round kind of makes it difficult, kind of makes the fantasy football draft more of a mind game. And so the absence of Nick Chubb in the early rounds now certainly means that even though fantasy drafts may not seem quote-unquote exciting, they're more wide open than ever. Let's talk about the fantasy fallout now, because I think it's highly integral to understand what Nick Chubb brought to the Browns and what's being taken away from them for at least the first 4 games of the season. Obviously, we won't see production in terms of fantasy like we did with him in 2021 and 2022 when he was the running back 5 and running back 10 respectively in those fantasy football seasons. And right now, a lot of people are projecting that either he's going to be a lower tier flex option who you draft in the latter rounds, or not drafted entirely. Maybe you are looking at someone else on the Browns roster. However, if you should, much unlike the Jonathan Brooks situation. There's a lot of value at the running back position for the Browns. However, there is a lot of pressure on this particular player to perform because, well, he might be the only healthy option the Browns will have for a long while, and that is, of course, Jerome Ford, entering his third year in the league. Last year, career highs in rushing and receiving yards. Maybe that's fate of circumstance, and maybe it won't happen again because Deshaun Watson's now the full-time QB there. But here's the thing. Against the Pittsburgh defense, he did have 24.1 fantasy points. That goes to show that he can perform against top-level defenses, and he did average 12.9 fantasy points from weeks 3 to 17. It's not Nick Chubb RB5, RB10 levels, but it's consistent enough that even he can be seen as a high-end flex option, maybe until the end of the season, because I consider him, even with Nick Chubb, to be very valuable to what the Browns do on offense. I really think that the Browns are a team that are going to be a little bit run-heavy this year, not necessarily a knock on Deshaun Watson and what he might be able to do in this offense if allowed to get the best out of himself. But I think that for the most part, this Browns offense will contribute most of its success or attribute most of its success to the run game. That being said, when I compare Jerome Ford to Nick Chubb now, Nick Chubb more so seems like a either first or second down back who really sets you up, and Jerome Ford is one of those guys who's able to exploit defenses more. And it kind of feels weird to say because this very well could have been the other way around many years ago, but I think that right now that's how I see this Browns offense panning out, with Jerome Ford kind of being the exploitative back in terms of his abilities and agility downfield to really open up the run game, maybe open up the pass game a little bit more. In other words, though, let's talk about another very injury-prone Browns running back in D'Onta Foreman. A lot has gone on with D'Onta Foreman for the Browns, especially in the offseason and in training camp. Harrowing neck injury in training camp. Kind of one of those injuries that you never want to see happen, especially in a training camp situation. And then, even though he was ready to play in a preseason game against the Seattle Seahawks, did suffer a rib injury as well, so he will also be out. So this is all Jerome Ford's backfield for the time being, which, in a way, is kind of a boon if you do decide to pick up Jerome Ford, whether it be through the draft, the latter stages of the draft, or through streaming on the waiver wire. But it's also kind of a negative because here's the thing I want to see out of the Browns the most on the offensive side of the football. I want to see Kevin Stefanski, and I've said this a lot on the show, go back to what he did best with Baker. Because that's the way that I see success, not just from tertiary players in this offense like a Jerome Ford, like maybe a Jerry Jeudy, like maybe a David Njoku sustaining his success that he found with Joe Flacco last year. That's the best way that I see forward, a path forward for the Cleveland Browns. Now, I'm not saying that if Deshaun Watson performs swimmingly, does so well, we forget about the trade that happened or circumstances surrounding the Browns offense and its deficiencies in his tenure, but it just brings more promise. That being said, if it becomes more like what we saw in Kevin Stefanski's first years in Cleveland, then I think there's going to be more opportunities for diverse target shares in this team. And I like Jerome Ford as a receiving back a lot. In the screen game last year, very, very effective, especially with Joe Flacco. But he's going to have to replicate it, for one, with Deshaun Watson. And two, most importantly, I think that Deshaun Watson is going to want to develop a rapport with the receiving cast he has. It's not necessarily the most exciting one. We've talked about them a little bit on this show. But I still think they have good enough weapons where Deshaun Watson just has to be serviceable, much like Baker Mayfield was in that first year with him and Stefanski. So the Nick Chubb injury isn't necessarily weird in the fact that the team will suffer without him, more so like what we were talking about with Brooks, where it was a little bit weirder. The running back situation in Carolina was up in the air. This Brown situation is a little bit more optimistic because even if Nick Chubb comes back after that 4-game timeline from the PUP list and doesn't necessarily perform, I still think that Jerome Ford will, depending on whether or not this offense stays kind of similar to what we've seen in the Deshaun Watson era, or kind of diversifies back to what Baker Mayfield was doing, I still think that at the end of the day, the whole situation surrounding this has a much more positive outlook, even if Chubb is not the same anymore. However, the one caveat is the structure of this offense. Can the scheme fit the players they have? Can Deshaun Watson, most importantly, execute with the players he has? Because right now, at this current moment in time, he clearly has not lived up to the billing of his contract. And in order to at least salvage some of that, he needs to operate in a way where both him and Kevin Stefanski feel comfortable with what they're doing. And right now, I just don't see it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, because this situation, it kind of feels weird to say it's optimistic, but I think it's much more positive when we look at other injuries, especially whether we're talking about next, surround the NFL in terms of fantasy options and fantasy fallout surrounding it. So let me know what you guys think about it in the comments. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, we do talk about another injury, giving you an update and some fantasy implications surrounding that, but this time with a tight end. You don't want to miss this segment. We'll be right back after the break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second one of the day, I do want to remind you yet again that you should consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network. Everything you do for the network is greatly appreciated. Also, if you haven't already, now that we are a live show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features that YouTube has to offer. I really want your input in the show. Questions, comments, or concerns are all accepted. I really enjoy the interaction that this brings to the show, and you guys have been great with it so far. So if you so desire, that is a great way to support the show. Me and my fellow podcasters, go check them out as well, and the network as a whole. So anything you do, like I say, is greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's jump into our second injury/fantasy fallout of the day, because this one is also a little bit weirder. It's in a very diversified market in terms of fantasy football. It's at a position where, even though it's getting revolutionized, it's still one that creates a lot of tension. Most importantly, it's on a team that is really kind of injury hit and injury laden because of all the circumstances surrounding it as well. It's really kind of one of those injuries where you're not necessarily confident in the output of the team. But that being said, it's a great way to reinterpret the market and get us back into that mindset of the revolutionary tight end market. So that being said, let's go into the injury update and fantasy implications surrounding TJ Hawkinson. Now, TJ Hawkinson, much like Nick Chubb, ACL tear early last year. Another injury that might keep him out for longer than the 4 games that's required for staying on the physically unable to perform list. But the reason why this one's much more intriguing and much more in-depth in terms of the ways you can analyze it is because of the fact that A, the Vikings are outside of TJ Hawkinson and loaded at tight end, and B, it really fits into a fantasy strategy that a lot of people might want to employ concerning an injured player. And it's kind of the reverse of what we're talking about with Jonathan Brooks, right? Where the Jonathan Brooks injury, you could have picked up a guy like Chuba Hubbard who might not be on people's radars and keep him for as long as Jonathan Brooks is out. This time around, TJ Hawkinson might actually be a guy you still draft. And the reason why I say this is because at the tight end position, right, when you get to the middle rounds, it opens up drastically. And even though we always talk about, well, which direction do you want to go? Do you want to stay youthful with a guy like Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, guys of that nature, or go to the age group? There is a mix of tight ends who don't really fit either profile. They're guys who are just solid. And Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, yo, Hawks the Rock, grad and holds for week 5 if you can stomach the roster spot. I agree. I think that TJ Hawkinson works perfectly for strategizing in fantasy football, whether your draft is over right now or if you're already looking at the waiver wire for week 1 and the many weeks to come ahead. Because in the past couple of seasons, top 5 tight end in 4 of the last 5, outside top 12 at the very least would be a normal projection for what TJ Hawkinson brings. And especially to a Vikings offense that might need it. I actually like the weapons the Vikings have outside of, Justin Jefferson. I really like Jordan Addison. Maybe, a wide receiver 3 like Brandon Powell really steps up. But I really think that a lot of people are underestimating the talent and depth Minnesota had at the receiving position. Sam Darnold might be a little bit skeptical at the QB position, but let's give him a chance. He kind of, because of fate of circumstances, in a precarious situation where he may not have expected to be the full-time starter, but that is what he's going to be, and so we'll have to give him the benefit of the doubt for at least some time. But back to the whole Hawkinson situation. Hawkinson is a guy you can really use to your advantage at a interesting position in fantasy. And when I look at the kind of pessimism surrounding the tight end position for the Minnesota Vikings, I think he's worth stomaching the roster spot, much like Shep Easy Sweet Spot said, because I don't think you're going to find any true hidden gems within the Vikings tight end room. Johnny Mundt and Josh Oliver, as much as they could project to be guys that Sam Darnold might like, really aren't it. I mean, Johnny Mundt, for what it's worth, on 13 total targets in the last 2 games this season, had stat lines where he had 1 touchdown, 39 yards, and 4 catches, 5 catches, and 58 yards, and it was good enough for top 12 production. So, for what it's worth, in those 2 games at the very least, he had that. But at the end of the day, I still think that, TJ Hawkinson is going to be a wild card. And in terms of the tight end market and reconsidering how we are viewing it right now, I think that if more and more tight ends in those middle rounds were to either have gotten injured or for some reason haven't been able to produce, then the whole tight end question becomes rather a moot point. As poets, seers, and sages, Darnold's a joke. No way he gets him to 500. I mean, we'll have to see. But at the end of the day, I think that Sam Darnold is at least a serviceable guy. And we've seen teams before in these situations have these kind of quote-unquote serviceable, competent enough, reliable QBs where they are either a bridge option for 1 or 2 seasons or they eventually become the next big thing. I don't think Darnold, obviously, they're expecting JJ McCarthy to start next year, so I think Darnold will stay. At the end of the day, I still think you give him the benefit of the doubt. With that being said, I think that the most important thing that we could take away from this whole situation, not just for the Minnesota Vikings implications, but from all of fantasy, is that whenever a position, as Splash Bro says, KOC whispers him to 9 wins. I kind of like that comment a lot. I mean, I love what Kevin O'Connell's been doing there, and I love the way that the whole profile of this offense could be looking, but they are one of those teams who feel so boom or bust, especially in the competitiveness. As Splash Bro says, they still missed the playoffs in that division. That's the point I'm trying to make here. It is the NFC North, one of the more competitive divisions. We expect that out of them. I appreciate these comments because the Vikings are a team that, for the most part, outside of, say, Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson, don't necessarily look that appealing in terms of fantasy. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. Because TJ Hawkinson adds that much value when you think about teams with competent tight ends, that you should be taking a flyer on him. And if you haven't drafted already, be considering him in the latter stages of your draft because of the fact that he resets the tone in terms of the tight end market. Now, as a whole, the tight end market probably won't suffer, quote unquote, because of this injury. The sky is not falling in terms of how people are going to view tight ends, because I still think that a lot of people might gloss over TJ Hawkinson, but as Chep Easy Sweet Spot says, don't sleep on Addison. I need to see more out of Addison. I think that in this offense he has potential to be a big play threat, but at the end of the day, once Hawkinson comes back, I think he's going to be the second guy in terms of targets. That being said, when I think about the whole profile of the tight end market in terms of fantasy, people, like I said, might gloss over the Hawkinson thing, and that should be to your advantage because TJ Hawkinson is one of those guys who has to fit in somewhere in the tight end picture. I'm kind of sick and tired of talking about guys like Laporta and Kelsey who are at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of excitement and hype. I want to talk about the guys who definitely should get the respect that they deserve, even if, circumstances, whether it be through the ineptitudes of their offenses or their injury history, don't get the respect they deserve. And TJ Hawkinson is one of those because at the end of the day, he's not necessarily, Nick Chubb, who's this revolutionary guy in terms of what he meant for the running back market. But TJ Hawkinson is just a solid, quote-unquote, security blanket kind of tight end who any quarterback would want to have. And I think that should he come back off the PUP list in that amount of time, return against the Jets, from that point forward, look out for the Minnesota Vikings, especially in fantasy. Because alluding to Shepee's sweet spot, it could open up and diversify a lot more with that three-headed monster of Jefferson, Addison, and Hawkinson. They might have to get, as poets, seers, and sages says, Sam D needs a blankie. I completely agree. He definitely needs someone like that. But at the end of the day, yeah, the question will become target share issues and things of that nature. But until that time, Expect the Minnesota offense to struggle a little bit, but once TJ Hawkinson returns, he's going to add a lot of value to your fantasy team, a lot of value to Sam Darnold, and most importantly, get people panicking about the tight end market, because the tight end market right now seems to be going in so many different ways, when in fact its power lies in the middle. Power lies in players like Hawkinson, resetting the value of the market, going under the radar, getting a little bit glossed over. Pounce on him late, and he will help you to great effect. Thank you for the comments, Poets, Seers, and Sages. I know you are a Vikings fan. You're not hiding from me, Dad. So, at the end of the day, I think that the Vikings are going to be one of those teams where tight end becomes their, like he said, blankie. I think that there are a couple of teams that can be talking about, and we'll talk about a player who I think definitely fits in that profile as well, kind of fits in a similar range as Hawkinson. I almost gave that away. So it's ultimately up to what you think of the tight end market. Continue letting me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we begin our draft or pass series with one of the more contentious wide receivers in the league. Young guy entering his second season. Is he primed for success or a sophomore slump? We'll have to see right after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Now this third segment kind of begins a little series right before we get into the thick of the NFL season. If you are one of those last-second fantasy football drafters, I'm going to present to you some guys who I think you should either target or avoid, thus calling it draft or pass. All of these guys are in a similar space, whether because of their position's market, whether it be because of teammate competition, or whether just because I personally do not think these guys have the oomph to elevate themselves at their respective positions, get into the highest level. I just think that right now these guys are in a situation where you are starting to think, well, are they boom or bust? And this first guy is no different. I really like what he did last year. Set the standard as a rookie receiver, single season rookie records for both receptions and receiving yards. A guy who really came into an intriguing situation and presented himself as someone who could, at the end of the day, be a reliable wide receiver in the NFL. And that is, of course, Puka Nacua. But there are still some questions surrounding Puka Nacua, and particularly the Rams. And I mean this in the best way possible. The Rams have so much wealth in their disposal that it's almost going to be a bloodbath in whoever gets the lion's share of the targets. And this is all reliant on Cooper Kupp's health, but of course you have to start thinking about that dynamic. And so here's why Puka Nacua immediately has become one of those quote-unquote boomer bust players. I don't necessarily think he's right in the mix of boom or bust. He's on the precipice. But I just think that for now he's one of those players who either you are considering drafting or a little bit apprehensive about. And it all starts where I said with the whole Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp dynamic. But here's an interesting stat line. Over 12 games in which they played together, once Cooper Kupp came back from injury, Nacua actually had more targets, 102 to Kupp's 97, more catches, 62 to Kupp's 59. Receiving yards, 944 to Kupp's 739. As Tap to Learn says, Puka over Kupp. Now, let's not be too hasty and jump to conclusions here, because I am giving Puka the benefit of the doubt here with these stats, but my ultimate verdict might say otherwise. As Cuppy, welcome Cuppy, I believe you are a new commenter, got an interesting take, wondering your opinion on it. Is there a real chance Barkley is part of the brotherly shove now instead of Hurts, hurting Hurts' value? I love this comment. Welcome Cuppy, thank you for the comment. That is a fantastic one. Obviously alluding to the tomorrow night's game between the Packers and the Eagles in Brazil should be an exciting one. And the question of Saquon Barkley, how is he going to fit into this Philadelphia Eagles offense? And you bring up the kind of fulcrum, the X factor, the focal point of the Philadelphia Eagles offense, the brotherly shove. It's a play, highly contentious. I think that Saquon in this offense really wouldn't necessarily make sense otherwise in situations like that. I don't necessarily think it hurts his value, because I do want to see Jalen Hurts be more of a deep ball thrower. But at the end of the day, the dual threat ability that he presents is just so explosive, and it really could diversify the Eagles' offense. That's why I'm a little bit skeptical about the Eagles' offense. But to your point about the brotherly shove, I think that Saquon was just a weird acquisition for them overall. I didn't necessarily see what's going to fit with Jalen Hurts in this offense. I actually like DeAndre Swift more in this offense because he made more sense as a supplementary player. But I think that it's a good opinion. I think that there is a chance that maybe Saquon takes a little bit of that away. With that being said, it's only 1 yard and it could come anywhere on the field. Nobody really knows when and where the brotherly shove is coming. So I think for touchdown opportunities, maybe Jalen Hurts gets a little bit more of the action. But in open field situations, who knows? Saquon has that ability to really make you rethink how you have to defend him, because you can get the chunk plays, the 5 to 6 yards, and he can also break off 30, 40-yard runs. So it's a really interesting question to wrap your head around, because that's the same kind of opinion I've been thinking about. How is every piece going to fit? As Cuppy says, yeah, my thinking is, why risk your franchise guy when you got a big back like Saquon? I'm kind of in the same camp, because every single play that you're running in, like, say, 3rd and short, 4th and short situations, you don't want Jalen Hurts, continuing to, because at the end of the day, you can use him in many different ways in the run game as well, where he just doesn't have to be pushed into an offensive line. That's a fantastic point, Cuppy. Thank you yet again for commenting. Fascinating comment. Really good question. Keep all your opinions coming. We cherish all your opinions here on this show. It will really make this show better as we continue to get into the NFL season. So thank you for your comments. I really am intrigued to see what the Philadelphia Eagles offense looks like tomorrow night. Tune in tomorrow night as the Green Bay Packers take on the Philadelphia Eagles. Thanks for the input, says Cuppy. As Tap to Learn also says, Hurts had 15 rushing TDs last year. Not sure how many were tush pushes. That's another good point. He did have a lot of rushing touchdowns, tied for Allen. I think maybe behind Allen in terms of that stat. But it's a good stat to know, because dual threat ability does help in the QB market. But back to the conversation of Puka Nacua. Puka Nacua, like I'm saying, giving him the benefit of the doubt here, and the benefit of the doubt is speaking for itself. With him and Kupp together, Puka is kind of ousting him in so many different stats. We talked about the targets, the catches, the receiving yards, also more end zone looks as well, with 4. However, Kupp still averaged 5 catches, 60 yards per game, things of that nature. And so I think that when you look at the diversity of the Rams offense, the versatility that it presents, I think that Puka Nacua in that moment made more sense, because he had the opportunity, even though he was a rookie, to develop a rapport with Matthew Stafford sans Cooper Kupp. But now Cooper Kupp comes back into this offense, full bill of health, let's just say. Hopefully he doesn't get injured this year, knock on wood. And you have to start thinking, well, when we saw Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp sans Puka Nacua before he was drafted, Matthew Stafford really loved Cooper Kupp, perhaps as one of the best receivers. And remember, Cooper Kupp won Super Bowl MVP. And he could have even won Offensive Player of the year the Rams won the Super Bowl. So you can't discount Cooper Kupp in this offense. So that really adds a different dynamic. And then, even though I don't understand it, you add in Kyren Williams. We'll have to see. This is his second full season as the Rams running back, so we have to see if he can maintain the level of success we saw from him last year. You have interesting concepts that Sean McVay runs. You have speedsters and Tutu Atwell. You have a lot of different guys. So, my final verdict, some of you might be unhappy with it. I'm going to have to say pass on Puka Nacua. And it's not just because of Cooper Kupp that I'm saying this. Splashbro said, actually, Kupp's Yahoo ADP only 10 less than Nacua. 34 for Cooper Kupp, 13 for Puka. And that kind of makes sense because obviously when you get injured, your value decreases in terms of fantasy, especially if you didn't have a full season for you to be eligible for certain fantasy projections. So that's a good stat to know. Thank you for it, Splash Bros. The reason why I'm saying pass isn't just because of Kupp, though, even though it does play a huge part when I think about him. It's also the market. If you look at the wide receiver market, when Nacua and when Kupp are supposed to be drafted, guys like that, as Splash Bros has alluded to, you're looking at different receivers in perhaps better situations where they A, get the lion's share of targets, and B, you feel more confident in them because they've been in the league for some time. I'm not saying, say Keenan Allen is suddenly going to become good. Mike Evans is going to continue putting up consistent 1,000-yard seasons, but they've done it. Puka Nacua is in his second year, only 1 year in the league of his production, albeit with a system that really played to his strengths, but that system now brings back a receiver who won a Super Bowl MVP in it, who had developed a rapport with the QB beforehand, and is projecting to be one of the more volatile offensive schemes in the league because of what Sean McVay can do with so many different concepts. He loves distributing the football. He loved distributing the wealth. And last year, it kind of felt like Puka Nacua was kind of the bare necessities when Cooper Kupp was out. He was kind of forced into the spotlight. So, even though a lot of people are still very high on Puka for what he did last year, I'm passing on him for this year because A, I need to see it, B, the market is just so deep, and C, he's one of those players who has a solid wide receiver who already has plied his trade, was just unlucky to not play that much last year in Cooper Kupp next to him. So let me know what you think in the comments about my take on this. It's just my personal opinion, but you can have your own. Let me know what you think. That will just about do this segment. Coming next, we transition from wide receiver to tight ends, talking about a guy who really is projecting to be one of the top tight ends, but I have a couple of questions about. You want to see who I'm talking about right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you kind of like that little deep dive into a player who I think should be targeted or avoided. A lot of diverse opinions. Continue letting me know your opinions on each of these players as we go through them. But coming next, we have a very interesting tight end who I can't make heads or tails of because I want to like him, and I think he's going to be projected to be one of those sneaky under-the-radar guys who finds his way into the top 10 in terms of fantasy tight end rankings. But he's also a guy who I just don't like, at least in the field, if that makes any sense. I don't like necessarily his overall playing style, but that being said, he does project at the very least to be one of those guys who gets a good stat line in PPR or standard leagues, even maybe in dynasty leagues, if you like to continue following his story arc. And that is the draft or pass segment of Jake Ferguson. And the reason why I can't necessarily make heads or tails about Jake Ferguson is because he is in a very advantageous position for a tight end, but I just don't think his profile really fits what the Dallas Cowboys might need him to do this year. So let's talk about the Dallas Cowboys, because that will give us a lot of insight into what Jake Ferguson could mean. The Dallas Cowboys obviously are a team reliant on CeeDee Lamb. It's showing his extension. It's showing in perhaps how he matters even more over their quote-unquote franchise quarterback Dak Prescott, who hasn't even received any offer for his extension. So it just goes to show how many questions there are in terms of the talent surrounding Dak Prescott or whoever the Cowboys quarterback in the future may be, in terms of how to share the targets, because CeeDee Lamb obviously is one. But there is really no 1A, even though Jake Ferguson is kind of the next guy in line. And the reason why I'm not confident in calling him 1A is because obviously no one's really touching Lamb, and Jake Ferguson is a tight end. With that being said, I can make the case for him as a guy who in both standard and PPR leagues might be coveted because of the targets he gets and where he gets them. 23 red zone looks last year for Jake Ferguson. He projected this year, ESPN projections, 90 to 100 targets, projection of 70 catches and 700 yards. And that's what you want of a tight end. Furthermore, only 6 tight ends caught more TDs than Jake Ferguson last year. But here's the thing. You can love a tight end for getting a lot of red zone looks. But when you hear me talk, or any other pundit for that matter, talk about tight ends in a fantasy landscape, we talk about guys who are projecting to either be a breakout star or be in the conversation to be in that top tier of Laporta's, Kelsey's, Andrews, and Kittles. I want an all-around player. You know what I mean? Jake Ferguson, to me, just does not project that right now. He's a fantastic red zone threat. But at this point, the question is that all he can be? And I want to do something interesting here. I actually want to compare him to the guy who he replaced. Dalton Schultz, obviously, for some reason, not good enough for Dallas, goes to Houston last year. Ferguson actually did beat him in terms of yards. He had 761 yards last season. Dalton Schultz had 635 yards and 5 touchdowns. Comparing the offenses that Houston and Dallas had, where Jake Ferguson meant more, I would have taken Dalton Schultz's season over Jake Ferguson's, because if you are the Cowboys and you're consistently getting to the red zone, you want more out of your tight end if he's known as a red zone threat. So what I'm saying is, how can a guy who you replaced, even though you outproduced him, in a team with much better talent around it, produce as many touchdowns as you and just less yardage than you? That's my thing. I want to see Jake Ferguson adapt the role of understanding that he might be the second best quote-unquote receiving option in that Dallas offense. His floor right now, in my humble opinion, is 10 PPR points per game. If he, for some reason, gets any lower than that, then I won't be as high on him. So, my final verdict on him is draft, but with a question mark. Because a lot of you out there might like tight ends still in terms of touchdowns. Because that's what you think. If you can get at least 1 or 2 touchdowns out of your tight end any given week, then you might be saying, okay, I feel good about that. But tight ends have set the bar so high, they become some of the most versatile weapons for QBs everywhere. If you look at Travis Kelce, like, he has become almost like a wide receiver in so many regards because with his abilities to get open, his abilities to work in any area of the field. If you look at Sam Laporta as well, he's a guy who really works so well in that Detroit Lions system. And he also is in one of those kind of crowded wide receiver rooms where they have to distribute the wealth, and he put up fascinatingly good numbers last year as a rookie. So, you catch my drift. Jake Ferguson is in a tight end market where people are beginning to get out of the mindset of, okay, tight end, yeah, I'll kind of gloss over, pick a guy who I think could be good. Because guys are good now. And so, Jake Ferguson, he's not, quote unquote, flashy enough. And I don't want to use that term because it seems kind of cliche to call a tight end flashy. But that's what people are starting to think of right now. Jake Ferguson seems like a tight end a little bit behind the times. Now, in terms of how the Cowboys offense projects, maybe, with the addition of Kellen Moore, a couple more opportunities in the short to intermediate areas of the field might open up for Jake Ferguson. I think if you look at the profile Kellen Moore brings, he has worked with a lot of guys like Dak, and the thing that he does best with them is getting them to hit every level of the field. And I think that will really help Dak and will ultimately help this offense. And if so, it will help a guy like Jake Ferguson get out of this stagnant mode where you only use him in red zone situations. I think that was the problem last year with this offense. I think, that Jake Ferguson, the reason why he had so many red zone opportunities because a lot of people weren't catching up to him. But this year, it's different. He's not a surprise anymore. So there's going to have to be more versatile ways to get him open. It's going to be important to get him open because he might just be one of 2 reads that Dak is especially looking at down the field. Not to discount any other wide receiver or skill position player for the Dallas Cowboys, but those are the 2 guys that I'm really invested in on the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb and Jake Ferguson as receiving options. And this offense is highly dependent on Dak Prescott getting them that level. He has that connection with CeeDee Lamb. It's already a solid connection, and it could make Dak a lot of money if he continues with that. So maybe that rapport will play over into the season a little bit more. But when Dak is forced to look at more options, Jake Ferguson is going to be the next one. And the question is going to be, well, where is it going to come? Is it going to come in the red zone where, yes, touchdowns are nice, but it's not what you want. You want more volume in terms of your tight end. Or is Kellen Moore going to figure out a way to ultimately work Jake Ferguson into this lineup? So those questions are going to have to be answered because when I think about the Cowboys, and not just this year, but their future as well. Let's put Jake Ferguson in a dynasty setting. Jake Ferguson in a dynasty setting actually makes a little more sense. For the long-term future of this franchise, I think that Jake Ferguson is going to be a guy. Yes, they're going to have to invest a lot of money in a lot of different places. Micah Parsons' contract extension is coming up. They're going to invest a lot in the O-line. They want to keep that intact as well. But Jake Ferguson's going to be a guy who they might have to tie down, because who knows the future of this skill position core, especially at wide receiver. So, Jake Ferguson, let's look at him as a long-term project for the Dallas Cowboys. If you're in a dynasty league right now, I would be saying you might want to think more archaically about the tight end position, because Jake Ferguson is someone who is likely to progress as years go on. And even though in standard and PPR leagues might stand for something that the volume he gets in the red zone carries over, but in future years, if Kellen Moore is effective in this offense, then we could see Jake Ferguson becoming a better all-around tight end. So if you're in a dynasty league, then I would definitely take that question mark away from draft, because he is someone who, if you're playing in a dynasty league, you can start to think more along the lines of, okay, maybe I can start to think about how these players progress, because it's all about progression here with a guy like Jake Ferguson. I'm not talking about a Sam Laporta or a Travis Kelce. We're talking about a guy who has room to grow, and we're talking about a guy who right now is a kind of a fantasy enigma. So my final diagnosis of Jake Ferguson is that he's going to be a solid tight end. But I just want to see his game become diverse enough where he's solid in every aspect of the game. He understands his value to his offense, and most importantly, for the long-term future, he's someone who the Cowboys can rely upon, because right now the Cowboys could be in limbo in terms about their whole contract situation. So look for Jake Ferguson to progress maybe in a dynasty league. I'm all for him in a dynasty league, but right now, the reason why I'm putting an asterisk next to him is because of that kind of barrier between being a red zone tight end and being a quote-unquote revolutionary one. That will just about do it for this segment. Let me know what you think about him in the comments. Coming next week to conclude our show with a running back, a guy who I'm still waiting to see if he can become a breakout star at the running back position and really kind of reset the market yet again. We're going to have to see who it is after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We conclude with a running back draft or pass. Now, like I said before the quick break we just had, this is a guy who I really also can't really make heads or tails, because he was expected to have already been a breakout candidate, and yet here we are still waiting for him, because this is a guy who I think can reset the market if he has a fantastic season this year. He has the volume, not necessarily the efficiency just yet, to be one of those guys who I'm really high on. That being said, the depth that this team has now at the running back position, coupled with the fact that they're getting more comfortable in the pass game, does still give me pause. We're going to have to see what my final verdict is. But let's just jump right into my kind of fantasy draft or pass analysis of Rachaad White. Now, Rachaad White, like I said, is one of those guys who I feel like a lot of people are continuing to underestimate, but it's not their fault. I think that it's kind of Rachaad White's not fault, but it's just his circumstance where for some reason he hasn't necessarily broken out to be a player that a lot of you can rely upon in fantasy. Because looking at the stats, and some important stats here in terms of deciphering whether or not he's a solid fantasy running back, they really stand out. But the difference in some stats that are less important and some stats that are more important are what are drastically kind of hindering him from breaking out, in my opinion. So let's look at some of the good stats. And what I talked about before the break was the volume he's able to produce. He was actually the RB2 in carries last year, averaged 16 per game, RB4 in catches per game, 3.8. So RB4 overall in those statistical categories. And at the very least, he's an efficient receiver as well. 8.6 yards per reception. He was the RB5 in that regard. But then we get into the actual rushing numbers. 3.6 yards per carry for Rachaad White. That saw him be the RB36. 1.66 yards after catch. RB32. So as you can see, Rachaad White has all the ingredients to put together a fascinating breakout season. The volume's there. They rely on him a lot in that backfield. They have the numbers to prove it. But if he can't rush the football effectively early on, chances are either A, he's going to decline, or B, we're going to see a young guy in Bucky Irving who they just added in the draft get a lot of touches. And the way they're talking about this kid in camp, they're talking glowingly about him. Glowing reviews about Bucky Irving. Cuts into his touches. And if Bucky Irving can actually prove to be a more valuable rusher, then Rachaad White made us become a situational back. And it feels weird because the time 2 years ago when Rachaad White was starting to become, the full-time back for Tampa Bay, it kind of made sense at the time because what we saw out of Rachaad White was not necessarily typical of a starting running back, but it made sense for what they had to do. As Splash Bro said, 336 touches last year. Only Run DMC had more with 339. So that's a fantastic stat to analyze because we talk about volume. That is a very important stat in terms of fantasy football. That being said, he just has to put it all together efficiently over a 17-game NFL season for me to have true trust in him. And so that's the balance here with Rachaad White. Let's go back to when he first started in the league, like I was talking about. It made sense for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers because at the time, you had a very, as Splash Bro said, they were playing from behind, so he's going to get more receptions. That could be the case, but I do think that the Buccaneers offense is a better offense than you're giving them credit for here. I think that they're going to have a lot of winnable games in the NFC South. Baker Mayfield, he lost Canales, but I still think that in this offense he'll continue to exceed. I like Liam Cohen coming into this offense, so we're going to have to see with him. So you're definitely giving them a little less credit than they deserve. But let's talk about that receptions point a little bit more in depth. As Plashmo says, Baker steps back. We're going to have to see. With Canales, he seemed like one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. With Cohen, I don't know what the case is. I like Liam Cohen as a name. Worked with a lot of good passers, so we're going to have to see. Let's talk about how Rachaad White's role has grown and how, most importantly, it can help or hinder this team. Now, the reason why I didn't want to talk about Rachaad White's nascent stages as a Tampa Bay Buccaneer full-time back is because, obviously, when we first heard his name, he was playing with Tom Brady. And the Tampa Bay offense was very kind of timing-based. Tom Brady was a very metronomic presence, kept them on schedule, and Rachaad White was just a supplementary back. Now with Baker Mayfield, I think that even though, a large part of what they did was down to Dave Canales and down to what he could do with Baker Mayfield as the quote-unquote QB whisperer for him, I think a lot of it comes down to, Rachaad White being relied upon still as a situational back, but not making that much sense as a situational back or a supplementary back or whatever have you in that offense. Because Baker, in my opinion, stays more on schedule, out of schedule. Off-script plays are kind of Baker's MO. When he has time to kind of create off-script, that's where he's best. And also in play action as well. So it all depends on what you think about how Rachaad White fits as well. Because in my humble opinion, Rachaad White in a timing-based offense makes a little sense. Because with the volume of targets and touches that he's receiving, it just makes more sense for him to be kind of a more physical back. And we don't often see that in today's NFL. But with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, when I think about them over the years, they've had some guys who were more physical in nature at the running back position. I think about Doug Martin for many years. He wasn't necessarily the most explosive back, but he got the job done because A, he kept the offense on schedule, and B, he didn't do too much in terms of trying to go for that explosive run play. That being said, there are still opportunities for the Bucs to use Rachaad White as a receiver even more. And even though, I want to see more out of him as a rusher, if that's the direction the Buccaneers offense is taking, then why not play into that opportunity? Because he did have better receiving stats. He got more yards per reception on the receiving stats than as a rusher. So I still think that there's hope for Rachaad White in terms of how diverse he can be in this Buccaneers offense. But right now, the real hang-up I have on him is what makes most sense for the overall player profile of him. Because I still can't stop thinking of him as a guy who is a kind of chunk play guy. Can get you 5 or 6 yards and not necessarily 20 or 30 yards. And so that's where I'm kind of going from. But I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, and my final verdict will be draft. And here's why. I think that even though Splash Bros did not give them benefit of the doubt, we are talking about an offense that, even though it has a lot of skill position players, is very volatile, and it tends to be volatile this season especially. Because like I said, Baker Mayfield fits a certain image. But if we look at what happened with him last year, it was kind of unexpected that Baker would just be in a similar situation to what he was in his last season in Cleveland. I didn't expect to see that. I thought Baker would mightily struggle last year. And this year, I think, honestly, even though you have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin is a solid, at the very least, wide receiver too, I still think that there could be a wall early on that Baker Mayfield faces between what he had in Canales' system and Liam Cohen's system. I'm not knocking Liam Cohen. I just want to see if he maintains what makes Baker Baker, and good Baker most importantly. So Rachaad White could essentially go back to what I want to see out of him, but also has the potential to be exciting as well. I'm a wait and pick up Bucky on waiver if he's around the Shep Easy sweet spot. Yeah, there's another opinion too. I think that Bucky Irving also plays a role in this. If he's the receiving back, then maybe Rachaad White will be forced back into being what I want him to be, which is kind of chunk play back. And so the overall kind of profile of what I want to see out of Rachaad White lays with how this team is going to look offensively. If Liam Cohen adopts many of the same principles that Dave Canales did and lets Baker be Baker, then I think that, Rachaad White could improve as a receiving back, and in PPR leagues, he could potentially be someone you look at. But adding Bucky Irving, as Shepy's sweet spot alluded to, also calls into question what they want out of the receiving game. And also, will it make more sense for Rachaad White to be what I want him to be? That being said, I still think he could be a valuable asset off the bench or as a flex option for you if you do so draft him. But let me know what you think in the comments. But that will just about do it for today's show. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your lovely comments. Continue leaving questions, comments, or concerns for every show. Continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features on YouTube. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show first and foremost overall. It's a great support to both of my fellow podcasters and the network as a whole. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host these shows. That being said, I've been Chris Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We'll be back tomorrow, same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm out. Enjoy the start of the NFL season as well. I'll be talking a little bit about that tomorrow, but I'm out. Other than that, thank you all for tuning in.